Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. This is one of a series of podcasts we are doing to highlight the glories and wonders of our September issue of Commentary, available at commentary.org. Please subscribe to Commentary so you can read our wares. Please go to Apple and iTunes and give us a glowing 5-star review for our work here on the podcast. And please like and subscribe on YouTube. I'm here with Executive Editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
And also with us is Hudson Institute's Senior Fellow, Todd Lindberg, author of our September 2026 cover story, How We Won the War on Terror, 25 years after 9/11. So this is a very large claim that you are making, Todd. And I think if you asked a lot of people, did we win the war on terror, they would be inclined probably to say no, or there never was one, or whatever it was is long over. So give us a sense of how you define it and why you think we won it.
Yeah, the global war on terror is something that George W. Bush inaugurated days after the 9/11 attack. And of course, it has since become very closely associated with Iraq and Afghanistan. And those are interesting problems, and we should talk about them. But it's always been much more to it than that. The first element of it was really the decision of Bush to take this war to the sources from which it originated. So go after them, take it to them. Do not operate purely in a reactive mode. And across a lot of global conflict, this war in particular has been very successful. The other thing I would say, and I refer as well to a piece that Abe wrote 15 years ago on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, where he observed that, there was not a comparable attack following up on the U.S. homeland of this degree and severity of 9/11. And what he said then was true, and 15 years later, it's still true. And this is also, I think, a quite remarkable achievement that has a lot more to do with taking a look at what's happening abroad, as well as working at home to discover and foil plots.
Abe, so yes, the piece that you wrote, which essentially argued this in 2011, and we had a very interesting symposium related to the piece with you and Ross Douthat, and Ross was far more skeptical about all this, in part because of the confusions introduced by the ongoing actual conventional conflicts that we were involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, as opposed to this conceptual framework that was called the global war on terror, which involved dealing at all levels with stateless actors who wanted to visit mayhem on civilized countries. And to do that, as Bush said, much of what we will do, you will see, and much of what we do, you will not see. And that this was the task. Bush did not, in a sense, overpromise, because he said this will be the task of a generation. This is not anything we're going to win, like the 6-Day War. This is a problem that has been gestating for a quarter century or more, and it will take a quarter century or more to end it. So do you see the same trends as Todd does in his work that you saw in yours?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think Bush was not only didn't shy away from the truth about what this would take, how much this would take, how long this would take, what a vast fight this was. He was in some ways overambitious, at least rhetorically, at points when he speaking about sort of ending terrorist extremism, from the planet entirely, or I'm paraphrasing, or whatever it was. But I also agree with Todd entirely that, first off, there was a sense, even when you said it, that you say it now and you say it then, that we have not been hit. on a anywhere near a scale comparable to the 9/11 attacks. There's a sense that Americans took that for granted, as if, oh, well, that was going to be the way it was going to be anyway. They were only going to have that one shot, which is absolutely not true. That's quite something to take for granted. There were attacks all around the world, large ones. The other thing is, yes, Iraq and Afghanistan eclipsed the larger war on terror, but the more I look back on Iraq and Afghanistan, the more I see those as arguably total victories as well.
Okay, let's
victories
go
that we
there.
squandered or whatever, but yeah.
Well, let's go there because, Todd, you make this point that if you look at Iraq under Saddam Hussein takes power in 1969. Iraq, until 2003, was one of the most destabilizing countries on earth, was the cause or fundament of at least three major wars: the war with the United States in 2003, the war that we had to engage in after it swallowed up Kuwait in 1990, and the Iran-Iraq war, which went on for 8 years in the 80s. And he was he was a state sponsor of terrorism, trained groups, had training facilities for terrorists, exported terrorism, stuff like that. And Iraq, since 2003, may be whatever Iraq may be, but it has ceased to be a problem outside its borders.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think one of the common mistakes that's made, not only in relation to the Iraq question, but also in relation to many other issues in U.S. foreign policy, is that people take a good consequence, namely that Iraq is no longer a major force for instability in the world, as if that's just the way that it turned out. It isn't. And the idea that Saddam Hussein, still in power after 2003, would be this contained, meek, non-threatening figure is, I think, quite fanciful. He's off the table. I think that's good. Now, as to the circumstances in which we intervened there in the first place, we were wrong about the WMD. There's no question about that. We got ourselves into serious trouble by failing to anticipate the Al-Qaeda and Iraq insurgency that blew up in 2004. And on our worst days, 2004 through 2006. And you know what? Even our best military people, namely our Special Operations Command forces on the ground there, were not prepared for that. They didn't exactly know. Now, we were fortunate because one of the great commanders in the history of the U.S. military, Stanley McChrystal, was actually in charge of that operation. And he reinvented special operations tactics and procedures and decentralized the whole thing, gave people a lot more autonomy, et cetera. And then came the surge, as well as the Anbar Awakening, in which the Sunni sheikhs essentially decided that they didn't want to be part of this Al-Qaeda and Iraq thing, but rather wanted to be on the side of the Iraqi government in defeating that particular problem. And a couple of years later, we were in pretty good shape in Iraq militarily. And, was this all a very costly enterprise? It certainly was. But it was even this was not the disaster that it has commonly been portrayed as. Once we got through these special operations defeats, special operations cooperative defeats with Iraqi forces of AQI. And then something really, I think, problematic happened, which is Obama, looking and surveying on this situation, thought that this situation was stable enough that we could essentially withdraw all of our forces, which we did in 2011. And that, in turn, led to the rise of the successor to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is the Islamic State, or ISIS, whatever you wish to call it, Daesh. That was a serious problem. We're talking about over the course of the next few years, after the black flags start appearing in Syria and Iraq, and Syria, by the way, being a magnet for kind of global jihadists, and who then swear their allegiance to Islamic State. And then, we're in a situation where we've got sort of this growing caliphate, and and beheadings and genocide against the Yazidis and widespread attacks against Christians, if not indeed genocide against those folks as well. It's a mess. And fortunately, Obama does realize that he's got a mess on his hands. And so he authorizes very begrudgingly, but nevertheless, a substantially greater American footprint for the purpose of degrading and destroying the Islamic State Caliphate, which we do. It takes past the end of his term. But that, too, I think, was a substantial achievement and, in this way, a kind of victory. And so that, that kind of takes, I think that is a better context for understanding the Iraq War. Yes, mistakes were made. There is just no question about that. But I don't think that it requires an entirely defensive posture in talking about it. Bush's second national security advisor, Stephen Hadley, whom I have tremendous respect for, said at some point, the problem with the Iraq War is that it cost too much and went on too long. And I think there's a better defense that ought to be resorted to with regard to it. It's not a complete defense. It can easily concede that the whole thing was a mistake. But to say that it went on too long and cost too much is also to feed that kind of endless war narrative that has been thrown about promiscuously as an attack on a comprehensive attack on what Bush did and was trying to accomplish.
You mention Obama having to basically go back into Iraq, having pulled out of Iraq, which doesn't give a lie to Hadley's analysis, which is cute, but says that we left Iraq prematurely. So not only didn't it last too long, we didn't fight it long enough. Had we stayed there, despite the fact that the president of the United States was not a supporter of the war to begin with, that caliphate would not have arisen. Similarly, had we not struck Saddam in 2003, it's not just Saddam. Like, Saddam had those two psychopathic sons, and we know what happens from Syria when psychopathic sons of a Ba'athist ruler decide that they're going to take power after their father dies. This wasn't just Saddam himself, it was his regime and the potential continuance of this regime and its aggressive posture against its neighbors and in terrorist actions. So oddly, it has become total conventional wisdom that either Iraq was a mistake or that it was something that we did for too long. And in fact, I think the historical record almost shows the opposite, though it's very hard to imagine that there's a way you run history backward and Obama doesn't do what he did. He almost did it in Afghanistan, and then wiser heads prevailed in Afghanistan. He was about to end the war in Afghanistan 10 years before Biden did the pullout, and Biden himself had idiotic ideas about how to end the war in Afghanistan. And somehow the wiser heads prevailed and said, hey, not only can you not do this because the Taliban can take root again, but we actually have a real shot at degrading them substantially. And then whatever happened. We did not have a full success in that counterinsurgency. But even there, we're in Afghanistan 20 years. We pull out because Biden says we've been here too long. It's time to go. Trump had said the same thing, but never pulled the trigger. And then we pull out of Afghanistan and effectively say this is really the end of the war on terror. We're done. Like, this is it. Our big incursion is over. And the pullout from Afghanistan, in terms of the way these things work, the ripple effects, not only reinstall this terrorist regime that hit us that was part of the force that hit us in 2001, but I think everybody really now understands that the pullout from Afghanistan gave the Russians the green light in their own heads to stage its war on Ukraine. So again, pulling out when we didn't need to unilaterally because we were tired had horrible real world consequences.
Absolutely. No, I look, the Biden decision was Biden's. I think everybody in the Biden administration actually agrees to that. It may well have been the last such decision that he made during his administration. I don't know, but because of the fiasco that ensued, Trump wanted out, yes, and he got talked out of it. In fact, he got talked out of it in a very dramatic way, which is his defense secretary, Jim Mattis, resigned after he was apparently not willing to be talked out of it. And I think, strangely, I mean, you actually, if you resign in that Trump administration, you actually kind of got the attention of the president. And so after the resignation, he changed course and decided that, it would be possible to say, he worked out a deal with the Taliban. The Biden people claim preposterously that this somehow was binding on them in terms of the timetable, whereas the Taliban had been so little in compliance with this agreement that it would have been entirely reasonable for the United States to stay the course, to stay there. We were not losing large numbers of combat people, military people in Afghanistan. The figures were under 20 for the last 3 years we were there. Now, nobody would say that's light duty. It's serious, but the presence that we had there, which was not a vast presence, was sufficient to backstop the Afghan military and to keep the Taliban at bay. And when we left, it collapsed, and this was a terrible, terrible defeat, and an entirely unnecessary one, brought to you by President Biden. And I was mortified by that at the time, and I continue to be. Again, there was no necessity. Just to return to the Iraq case, yeah, I think if there had been a senior commander in Iraq after the pullout, it would have been impossible to ignore ISIS as it was gathering. Even in 2014, Obama, in an interview with the New Yorker, calls the Islamic State JV compared to the original Al Qaeda. Well, it certainly was not, and fortunately, he came to realize that and did something about it. But who knows what's brewing in Afghanistan nowadays?
Yeah, I would just add to the point about the calamitous Afghanistan withdrawal. To Todd's point about how the American casualty numbers were relatively low in those last years. We lost something comparable to the number that we were of Americans who were being killed in Afghanistan a year. We lost something comparable to that during the botched withdrawal, and there was something about it. The ripple effects we still will be teasing out for a long time, because it was this sort of global American apology in action for having defended ourselves and for having done the right thing. And there's just no way to tell how bad actors are going to capitalize on that. And we're still living in this post-Afghanistan withdrawal age.
So let's talk about the domestic element of the global war on terror, because it's at least as important, at least in the sense that, it's 25 years later, 3,000 people died on September 11th. And the number of people who have died in homegrown terrorist attacks here in the United States over the past 25 years, numbers in the dozens, or maybe close to 100 over 25 years, and those are not sponsored from abroad. They weren't organized from abroad. We had the Boston Marathon massacre. We had the Pulse nightclub shooting. We had the San Bernardino Christmas party event. The fact that we can even name them like this, and in each case they were very destructive, particularly the Pulse bombing where 50 people died. But it's just you're not on the scale is just not the same. Whereas in Madrid in 2007, hundreds and hundreds of people died in a train station bombing. Britain on July 7th, 2007, mass casualty event there, terrorist event in the underground. So here we just had nothing. And yeah, we have come entirely to take this for granted, but getting to being able to interdict and make sure that this didn't happen was a political and controversial political process.
Well, it certainly was. On the one hand, there was I think there was a pretty firm resolve on the part of the American people that they wanted firm action to be taken in the interest of protecting them. And that is indeed a pretty high responsibility on our elected leadership. So, the first major piece of legislation was the Patriot Act. And I think, it's generally said that one of its most important, it did lower, the communications blockages between domestic and international counterterrorism activity. But also it allowed for new wiretap authority that essentially made it easier to track wannabe terrorists across multiple platforms, and you didn't have to get a warrant for each phone. You could do it differently, and that, by the way, was something that I think was the authorities have said was instrumental. I think they're right in tracking and disrupting the suicide bomb plot attempt on the New York City subway system in '09, and the law enforcement disrupted that thing, and plot came out of Colorado, and then they drove cross country, and but eventually, this is an attack that didn't happen and could have really been, I think, on at least on the scale of those European attacks you just mentioned. So you've got that, you've got the Transportation Security Act, which establishes the TSA of airport screening fame, thus setting the stage for 1,000 jokes about how grandmothers are getting frisked or something like that. But I mean, in fact, it's been a pretty effective deterrent in terms of getting weapons onto planes, and we haven't really seen a lot of maybe attempts in that regard. And so, many other pieces of legislation followed. We had the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the consolidation of a number of protective functions there, from the Coast Guard to the FBI to to the Secret Service, other agencies, FEMA, and is it a big new government bureaucracy? Yeah, it is, and I think that's okay with most Americans. And meanwhile, the FBI essentially reorganizes itself and sets up these joint terrorism task forces. There are now about 200 of them, one in each, at least one of which in each of the 56 field offices. And there's some that are organized more, functionally, looking at particular kinds of threats, water, food, et cetera. So, I mean, this was a pretty buzzing hive of activity. And, especially, it's all the more remarkable, I think, because we didn't know exactly what was going to come at us. So you had people who were, in the White House, in the streets. What was going to be next after 9/11? Think about the question: where, if you're old enough to remember where you were on the 12th of September in 2001, what did you think was going to happen next? Well, you didn't know, obviously. And you certainly didn't think that it was going to be, well, not much, really. You thought about things like, will there be other bombs going off, suicide bombers in Washington, New York, other big cities? Would there be now armed attacks by gangs, prosecuting the jihad in that way? Were they going to hit the water supply? Were they going to, be able to aerosolize anthrax and fly it in a crop duster over populations? The answer to those questions turned out to be no. But I don't think it turned out to be no for want of trying or a desire on the part of the jihadist element, both abroad and domestically. And the fact is that some recent academic study shows that we actually did get better at foiling plots in the years after 9/11 than in the years leading up to it. And I think that's that's testament to the seriousness of the effort that was undertaken, and ultimately to its to success. Now I have to say, tomorrow there may be a terrorist attack in the United States, one that we didn't see coming, and frankly, that would be bad. It would be a disaster. It will require reinvestigation, learning the lessons, finding out what went wrong on this one, et cetera. But that does not negate 25 years of relative safety of Americans following 9/11. And I think that is a critical point.
Yeah, I mean, just no war ends all wars, and no war on terror is going to forever, shut down the possibility or the eventuality of terrorist attacks in the future.
I mean, look at the country that is the most prepared country on earth for terrorism, and how to be how to stage counterterrorism, how to evade terrorist assault. That has been the country most attacked by terrorism over the last 60 years. Israel failed on before October 7th to see the worst terrorist plot that had ever been staged against it. So yeah, if anybody should have been able to have a 100% perfect rating on this, it would have been Israel, and it didn't. And yes, we are an open target. But just as you mentioned, and that's because of our Constitution. It's because we have free speech rights, we have freedom of movement. People can come into this country and speak their minds and organize, and freedom of assembly and all of that, and that can be used as a weapon against us and against our safety in the future. But when you talk about the TSA and the sort of the creation of security theater, which is what people, sneeringly called it, a lot of this was just rational barn door closing that turned out to be more than sufficient unto the day to prevent some of the kinds of attacks that in the 1970s in Europe, the Baader-Meinhof gang and the Red Army Brigades and others staged simply because everything was open. Just making sure that everybody who went into an office building in the United States had to show an ID card. It's possible that thousands of people are alive today who would have been dead otherwise had that weird little nothing of a policy been instituted, because you just stop people from even thinking that they have a chance to score a victory. So that's one of the many other reasons that we can say that the war on terror was won, if we think that the war on terror, this period, this quarter century, can be taken as a completed process, which of course you, Todd, say it can't, because terrorism will always be with us. Terrorism has been a tactic for, in the West for, I don't know, from 1881 onward, there's been a whole lot of terrorism,
Yeah.
So,
I think that it's also part of a broader lesson that I think we're rediscovering, which is we have enemies. Not because we need enemies, but because they hate us, and they don't. They would like to thwart us. They would like to neutralize our power and influence, and if possible, maybe kill as many of us as they can. And this requires an awareness. It's not a benevolent world out there, and I'm of course against overreacting, because overreacting is in principle bad, but I'm also against excessive complacency. And to the extent that the country has returned to its kind of September 10th, 2001 mood, I think bears some risks with it too. I think we have to face up to these other serious ongoing threats and anticipate them as best we can.
Just quickly and to conclude, a thought. This is not in the piece, but a thought that is raised by everything that we're talking about here has to do with American leadership, American presidential leadership, and a delusion that we can see across these presidencies from 2001 onward, which is that maybe constitutionally, if you are the president, you always seem to think that these challenges are going to be easier than they are. So Bush thought that Iraq took out Saddam before we took out the Taliban. There would be elections, write a constitution. They would go Democrat. We had various people in place to help rule Iraq and all of that. And it all went haywire or sideways because the hope, which was that this would be an easy thing sort of to do, became incredibly difficult. And then you have to go back in your head and say, if he knew then if he knew now what he knew then, would he have done it in the first place? And that's of course unanswerable. But Obama thought he could pull out of Iraq. He couldn't. Trump thought and Biden thought he could pull out of Afghanistan and that would be a triumph, and it was a terrible failure. And now we have Trump believing that he can go into Iran, bomb it for 6 weeks, and work his will and change everything there. Again, too easy. So there is some weird aspect of American leadership that makes these people who have nothing in common weirdly susceptible to the power of positive thinking about how their choices are going to make everything will go smoothly.
Well, they say, hope is not a policy. But hope is usually very much a part of the animating anticipation of the consequences of the policy choices one is making. And yes, as they also say, the enemy gets a say in this. We've there are some interesting, at a minimum, consolation prizes, I think, in Iran, particularly which we can point to in the absence of knowledge of what the outcome there is ultimately going to be. But, at least in potential, Iran really did have the capability of closing the Strait of Hormuz and owning it, at least for some period of time. And now they have exercised that. So good on us for realizing that the capability exists now. Unfortunately, whether you think this was the right way to find that out, I don't know. Now I think that there's an awful lot of pipeline building going on in the Middle East right at the moment, and that's probably a good thing too. And then we used up a lot of our ordnance in Iran. I don't necessarily. I think far fewer people know the details of that than pretend to know the details of that. But on the other hand, as I think Ukraine indicates, warfare is moving in an interesting direction and very quickly. And I think that we'd better get busy on not just replacing all of the extremely expensive countermeasures and attack measures that we have used, but also thinking creatively about what is necessary in this age of drone warfare. There's a Council on Foreign Relations preventive survey. And you get to rank bad things that you think how likely they are and how damaging they would be. And I think one of the things at the top of the list this year was pretty much everybody, myself included, thinking that a drone attack, a major drone attack on the United States, seems pretty well within the realm of possibility. So what are we going to do about that? How do we anticipate it? How do we defeat it? Now we, in some ways, watching the drone zombie rise out of the ashes or the rubble in Iran, we've got a better fix, I think, on the nature of that problem.
So in the end, we have the war on terror, which is a war on stateless actors and the states that harbor, support them, or contain them. And drones are obviously the ideal tool across all of these platforms, since they are cheap, they're destructive, and they only involve a certain measure of proximity. And it doesn't even have to be that proximate, since the Houthis fire on Israel from 900 miles away, not effectively, but who knows where it'll be 5 years from now.
And it's much harder and more expensive to shoot them down than to fire them off. So they're asymmetrical in that sense, that you're already putting your target at that disadvantage.
Which was always true of terrorism, right? That's the whole point. Is that if a person is intent on strapping a bomb to his body and blowing himself up in the middle of Times Square, there is very little you can do to prevent that person, unless that person comes from abroad, so you can somehow keep an eye on him, or you can see where he came from or who he was talking to in the United States, if it's a larger plot or something like that. Terrorism has always had the effect of it can punch well above its weight, because people are willing to do things with tools that civilized people simply have never been able to resort to, simply out of a general humanity. And that's what we were up against there, and that's what we're going to be up against in the drone era.
Yeah, look, one of the criticisms, somewhat, I think, facile of Bush's global war on terror was that you can't declare war on a tactic. And what do you mean you're gonna fight terror? Well, no, obviously, but you can fight a war against terrorists, and the people who have this as their tactic. There isn't really much that Iran can do except lob drones at mainly often civilian targets, and this is the way of war. It isn't sort of the front lines of World War I or of World War II. I mean, yeah, it can become that, but in general, these non-state threats, they do what they can with what they have, and they do not play by the same rules that we do. The people have criticized drones for the damage they do to civilians, and this is an appropriate question to raise, because one must not target civilians, and one must be proportionate. This is true on moral grounds and on legal grounds, and the record is replete of, anecdotally anyway, of strikes that could have been taken that were called off because there were too many civilians in the area. But the fact that we have this considerable capability is one I think we should use. I think presidents have realized this. There are very bad actors out there. And the other thing that's said is that, well, you kill the top one, the other one just moves in. Yeah, that's also true. But it really does disrupt planning capabilities, et cetera, to take these characters out. And in fact, we know this not from my observations, but from the internal communications that we've also collected from, our special operations forces raids on these characters. And, they spell out Osama bin Laden's cache of documents kind of bemoan the declining influence of al-Qaeda. That's good.
Look, what did we do? We did decapitate al-Qaeda. In part, we went into Afghanistan. We took people from the battlefield and we stashed them on our base in Guantanamo Bay. They were there because they were not citizens of any country, or no country actually wanted to have them. And we took them as chess pieces off the battlefield, just as Israel is taking systematically all the Hamas chess pieces off the battlefield, not beginning with, but including the mastermind, Hamas's mastermind, Yahya Sinwar. Does it matter that Yahya Sinwar is no longer there to come up with another brilliant plan to harm Israel, the way he came up with the October 7th plan? Of course it's better for Israel that he's gone. And of course it was better for us that Ayman al-Zawahiri was sitting in a jail cell in Gitmo. And we know because al-Qaeda became an ineffectual organization for the most part after we took active measures to take them down, which then concluded, of course, with the raid on Abbottabad and the killing of bin Laden. But that was 9 years into the war on terror, right? If we hadn't had a war on terror, I'm not sure we would have had a shot at him in Abbottabad.
It's sort of hard to imagine how how we would have. How could we not have had a war on terror? I mean, it would have required the presidents of the United States to explain to the American people that there really is nothing you can do, which, by the way, was the counsel of many people at the time who were being critical of Bush for trying to do something. You know, everybody who has joined the chorus of the global war on terror is a complete failure, an abysmal failure. You can't, if you look up casual references to the war on terror, it usually appears within a few words of the word failure, failed, abysmal failure, that kind of thing. And without prejudice to the negative aspects of things, including the disaster in Afghanistan, that's not really what the record shows.
I just want to add. Can I just add to that point, Todd, about the idea that people were essentially saying we shouldn't do anything, or we shouldn't do anything bold, or we shouldn't do anything forward-leaning. It's also the same people who were equally critical of Bush for not having done the impossible beforehand, for not having taken from a daily briefing that said al-Qaeda determined to attack the U.S. On American soil, and not having launched some sort of war on terror then, before the fact.
And by the way, an important point here, which is that if he had wanted to, he couldn't legally, because the means by which we would have been able to interdict the flight school guys and all of that, in which the CIA would have been legal or justifiable for the CIA to work domestically with the FBI to track them and take them down. It took the Patriot Act and the Homeland Security Act to make that possible. Before then, there was a wall between the agencies. And so even if that presidential daily brief of August 6th had triggered Bush is saying we need a war on terror, he would not have had the means to stop it by September 11th. And that's another aspect of this that we totally take for granted. Okay, so Todd, this is a very comprehensive piece you've written. It provides chapter verse detail, analysis, sobriety. Very authoritative. I'm very proud that we have published it. I hope that everybody who is listening will go to commentary.org and read Todd's piece, How We Won the War on Terror 25 Years After 9/11. And it's great to have you here. And Todd, by the way, my college roommate. So here we are it's 44 years since we graduated from college. It's 48 years since we started college. And here we are on this Zoom today. So, you never know. You never know what history will lead to. So, a chance placement across the hall in Mead House at the University of Chicago, 48 years later, has led to the publication of this article in the September issue of Commentary, Todd Lindberg's How We Won the War on Terror. So for Abe and Todd, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.